Hi there, and welcome to this training on managing stress and anxiety. My name is Kirsty Gwynn. I'm an emotional intelligence coach and trainer, and have chosen to specialize with a master's degree in applied positive psychology and coaching. So here's what we're going to be learning together today. We'll start off by making sure that we understand stress and anxiety, and then we'll take a look at how we can deal with it. So we'll start off by talking about how we can respond to the emotional side of stress and anxiety. We'll take a look at how to deal with anxious thoughts, as well as how to manage anxiety and stress-related behavior. And then I'm going to give you a process called RAIN that you can use to bring together everything that we've learned. We'll also touch on additional mental health support. So what exactly is stress and what is anxiety? Stress is the reaction experienced when the demands that have been placed upon us exceed the resources that we have to cope with those demands. So stress really occurs when there's an imbalance between what demands are on us, the pressures that are maybe put on us, what we have to do, what tasks we have to achieve, the deadlines that we have to meet, the expectations that we have to meet, and all the resources available to us in order to meet those expectations. So how much time do we have? Do we have the adequate skills, the adequate training, knowledge, etc. in order to meet those demands? And when there's this imbalance where we don't have enough resources to meet those demands, that's typically when we become stressed. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of unease, worry, or fear, and it can range from mild to severe. So anxiety rarely describes the whole spectrum of perhaps feeling nervous or mildly anxious, all the way to perhaps feeling panicked or paralyzed by anxiety. As many as 79% of British adults in employment state that they commonly experience workplace stress. And of those who are feeling stressed commonly at work, 55% say that they experience anxiety as a result. So stress and anxiety both come with various physical, emotional, and behavioral effects. So when it comes to stress, some physical effects you may be very familiar with yourself. So we may experience muscle tension or pain. We may experience chest pain or perhaps an increased heartbeat. Often when we become stressed, one of the first parts of our bodies to react is our heart rate will increase. And so you may be familiar with this one. Some people will suffer from stress-related headaches, from stomach problems, and for many people it will impact their sleep. So you may find that when you're stressed, you perhaps have trouble to fall asleep, or perhaps you struggle to stay asleep. So when it comes to anxiety, if you're experiencing anxiety, you're likely experiencing some of the stress symptoms as well as some additional symptoms. So maybe more intense heart palpitations, tiredness or fatigue, feeling sick, and even excessive sweating. So you may not necessarily experience all of these. You may only experience some. Some people will experience all of them. There are some common symptoms that we can identify, but many of us will have a unique response that will be only some of these symptoms. So let's look at some of the emotional effects of stress and anxiety. So when it comes to stress, we're really seeing that it is affecting our ability to think clearly. We're struggling to concentrate, and it's difficult to make decisions. And you may have experienced this effect of stress at work. Just at the moment when you most need to think clearly, it becomes difficult to do so. Maybe you feel overwhelmed. You start to notice that you have worries and negative thoughts, and even that you become forgetful. And this is really because we see that stress has a negative effect on the part of our brain that is responsible for being able to access our working memory, to plan in terms of a long-term goal, in terms of decision-making ability, problem-solving ability, and so on. All of those abilities that we really need at work, it seems that they are reduced when we're under stress. That is what research shows. So you may have experienced some of these yourself. Then anxiety, we have emotional effects, and they would include many of the stress symptoms and perhaps some additional symptoms. So, a sense of dread, restlessness, right? Or perhaps feeling constantly on edge. So, how are people coping with stress and with anxiety in British workplaces? So 40% of British adults in employment manage their stress by talking to family and friends, and this is therefore the most popular way to manage stress. And then a third of people are engaging in behaviors that maybe aren't serving them very well. So comfort eating, and another third increasing their use of stimulants such as caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol, all of which can obviously cause negative health effects. So I'd like you to take a moment to just reflect how stress affects you personally. It's really useful to build our stress awareness because this will help us to act to reduce our stress more quickly. So consider what tends to cause you stress and anxiety at work. Are there particular situations that you tend to find stressful? And you know that when they come up, you generally start to feel overwhelmed, or perhaps you start to feel anxious. Being aware of these is useful because I'm going to give you a number of techniques today that you can use to manage your stress or to manage your anxiety, and knowing what sort of situations that stress or anxiety tends to arise can help you to be more prepared. Consider what your thinking is like when you are stressed or anxious. Does it get negative? Do your thoughts start to feel like they're spiraling out of control and you aren't able to keep them positive or to stay present? And then consider how this impacts your behavior. How we feel has a very big impact on our behavior. So as we saw in the previous slide, a number of people were engaging in different behaviors to manage their stress and anxiety. What behaviors do you engage in to manage your stress and anxiety? Some of them may be healthy, and some of them may be unhealthy in that they're not serving your well-being. Additionally, we may notice that stress starts to impact how we're behaving towards others or how productive we are able to be at work. So consider that too. All of this provides us with more information that we can work with in service of managing our stress and anxiety. So the first place to start when it comes to managing stress and anxiety is understanding how they impact your body physically. This is really important because when you become stressed or you become anxious, the first thing to react is your body. Before you're even aware cognitively that you're feeling stressed or that you're feeling anxious, your body will be sending you signals. It will be showing you that you're feeling that way before you even are completely aware of that. So it's important to identify exactly how stress affects you. So we touched on this briefly when I invited you to become aware of your own symptoms of stress. This can be as simple now as thinking about what is the first way that my body tells me that I'm becoming stressed. Do you start clenching your jaw? Do you feel a knot in the pit of your stomach? Do you feel an almost weight on your chest? Or perhaps your shoulders start to go up and you get a lot of neck tension? Or a mild headache or a severe headache? What is the first symptom that starts to happen? Identifying this for yourself will help you to take action to relieve your stress as quickly as possible. Remember that the sooner that you can notice when you're feeling stressed or feeling anxious, the sooner you can react to that in a positive way using the techniques that you learn in this course. So speaking of which, let's get to our first one. Our first technique is rather simple and counterintuitive, and it's labeling. So if you have a difficult feeling come up, if you feel stressed or you feel anxious, many of us might have a tendency to just get on with things and not acknowledge that feeling. But research seems to suggest that our brain is almost trying to give us a message. So what we found is that when you simply label the feeling that you're feeling, you just state it to yourself. We see that brain activity in regions where this emotion is being created actually reduces. So the amygdala in the brain is really important when it comes to negative emotion. When you're feeling stressed or you're feeling anxious, we see that the amygdala is active in the brain. And this simple technique of saying, I feel anxious because, or I feel stressed right now, it does wonders for that part of the brain. It appears that simply acknowledging our feelings reduces brain activity in that brain region and therefore reduces the intensity of negative emotions. So I like to think of this as the fact that your mind may be trying to give you a message. Hey, you're feeling stressed or you're feeling anxious. If you choose to accept this message and just acknowledge it, then that amygdala can calm down. However, if you try and ignore this and we try and kind of just carry on with things, what we see is that stress signal, that anxiety signal is only going to get louder until we do acknowledge it. So this is such a simple technique, but I'm always amazed by how well it can work. So whenever you notice yourself becoming stressed, it simply means taking just a moment to acknowledge to yourself, I'm feeling however I'm feeling. And if you know why, just say why. So I'm feeling stressed right now because I don't feel that I have enough time to get everything that I need to get done. I feel anxious that they think my report is inadequate. Simply naming how you feel and why. If you don't know why you feel the way you feel, as sometimes is the case, that's okay. Simply try to name the feeling as specifically as possible. Remember that you can do this in work situations or you can do this at home. So it's equally valuable to be able to acknowledge to yourself, I feel hurt that my partner made that comment, or I feel very frustrated that my child has not listened when I asked that he clean his room. Simply acknowledging our feelings in this way can help to soften the feeling and make it more manageable rather than us getting caught up in it. Then our second strategy is psychological acceptance, and this one is also rather counterintuitive. One thing that we might do when we feel stressed, and particularly when we feel anxious, is try and push that feeling away. These are not comfortable feelings, and most of us don't particularly enjoy feeling stressed or anxious, so we might want to resist that emotion and try and change it. The last thing we think we want to do is accept it. But what we now know is that when we resist a negative emotion, it continues to stay. So there is a saying, what you resist persists. And this seems to be true when it comes to negative emotion. If we try and change our feelings, it's again as if the mind just says, well, I'm just going to turn this message up. I like to also consider that what we're really doing when we try and push a feeling away is just layering on another layer of stress or anxiety that we don't need. If you're feeling a difficult emotion like anxiety, so you're feeling anxious, and then you tell yourself, well, I shouldn't feel anxious, or if I feel anxious, then I'm not going to be able to think clearly, and I'm definitely going to make a mistake in my presentation. Now, not only do you feel anxious about the presentation, but you also feel anxious about the anxiety, and that is just more to deal with. So given this, we can understand that accepting how we feel and just allowing that feeling to be there can be really beneficial. What it essentially does is it keeps the feeling from growing. It just keeps it as small as it is. We don't layer on any unnecessary stress or anxiety. So this is a really, really useful technique for being able to hold space for these emotions. And one thing that I like to keep in mind here is that we are not accepting the emotion into the future. If you feel anxious, you will likely find it very difficult to accept that emotion if I were to say to you, well, you accept it now and you have to accept it weeks into the future. I certainly couldn't do that. Remember that you're only living in one moment at a time. We're only living in the present. You actually don't know what's going to happen in the future. You don't know when your stress will be relieved or when your anxiety will lift. So remember that when you're practicing psychological acceptance, it's really about staying present and just allowing that feeling to be here in the now, one moment at a time. You don't know how long it will be with you for. So remember that, again, this is something we can do at work, right? If you have to do something that feels difficult, for example, and you're finding it stressful, practicing psychological acceptance in that sort of situation can be very helpful to just hold that discomfort without resisting it and therefore minimizing it rather than increasing it or maximizing it. It can also be very helpful at home if we're struggling with any personal conflicts or any other difficult feelings at home, that we can also hold space for those. And we might allow these difficult feelings. We might allow our stress from work then not to bleed over into our personal life. And again, anything that's going on at home, by allowing it to be with us, we minimize its impact on our work. So here's a way to also reduce our negative emotion. And it's such a powerful but simple technique, as some of these are that I've shared with you already. And it's belly breathing. So remember that amygdala that I shared with you is responsible for creating these negative emotions such as stress and anxiety in your brain. So when we engage in deep breathing, it turns out that we also calm down brain activity in that amygdala. It seems to be our almost direct way of communicating with this brain region to say, I'm calm and everything is okay. So whenever you feel stressed or you feel anxious, this technique is particularly helpful for being able to calm yourself down. But it must be done correctly. So as many as 9 out of 10 people are actually not breathing correctly. And when I say they're breathing incorrectly, it turns out that they're breathing into just the top third of their lungs rather than using their whole lungs, breathing using their diaphragm. So I'm going to invite you to try this with me now, and it can be quite a shift. You would need to be either sitting in a hard chair where you can sit up straight or standing up. If you're slouched at the moment, we won't be able to get any benefits from belly breathing. So make sure that you are in a good posture position. So you might roll your shoulders back and notice that we're going to breathe into the belly rather than thinking about breathing into the chest. So we almost want to imagine that we're breathing using our belly, and that can help us to use our diaphragm and to breathe a lot deeper. So we would breathe in for 4 counts, and we can breathe in through the nose. We hold for 4 counts, and then we breathe out for 4 counts. So we inhale through the nose and we exhale through the mouth. And you can imagine, for example, releasing the air from a balloon really slowly. If you want some extra help in terms of breathing using your belly, remember that you can take a hand and put it on your belly so that you can feel that that is moving. You'll know that you're doing this correctly if your shoulders aren't moving too much. If your shoulders are moving a lot when you're deep breathing, that means that we are breathing too much, perhaps into the top of our lungs rather than breathing fully. So try that out. We'll go in through the nose, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, and out through the mouth, 2, 3, 4. So continue to try that on your own, and remember to use your belly to breathe. If you find this difficult, you can start off by releasing all the air and taking a long exhale, and then thinking about using your belly to bring in and to inhale more air. So pause this video if you'd like to try this now. Remember, this is an incredibly valuable technique that you can use to calm yourself down at any time. So you can use this to, if you're feeling stressed before an important meeting, you could use breathing to keep yourself calm. You could even use breathing on your way home just to release the stress of your workday so that you might transition into your home life. And you could equally use this breathing to be able to keep yourself calm if you were in a conflict with your partner. This is a really powerful way to release anxiety and to release stress. When you notice yourself becoming stressed or anxious, remember to pay attention to your thinking and be aware if your thoughts are becoming negative, which will increase your stress. Negative thoughts are a natural symptom of stress or anxiety, but unfortunately, they only tend to amplify our stress as we start to worry more and more about something that happened in the past or something that we fear will happen in the future. This only increases the stress response. And often we can fall into a number of different anxious thinking traps, which will only serve to amplify our stress and anxiety over time. However, becoming aware of these can be very, very helpful in terms of managing them. So I'm going to be covering a number of them today. You can keep an eye out for them. So the first anxious thinking trap that we might fall into is personalization. And that means that we might view the situation as a reflection of our capability, so how capable we are at our job or how valuable we are as an employee. So for example, let's say that we get some negative feedback in a performance review, or perhaps a client tells us that they aren't happy with something that we did. Perhaps we have these thoughts: I can't do this, I'm a fraud, I'm going to lose my job. These thoughts are really an indication that what we're doing is interpreting the situation to reflect our value and our capability. And we want to be aware of this. This is something that's very common when it comes to feeling anxious. What we tend to do is read too much into a certain situation. It is not a thinking trap that makes sense if we really consider it, because no one event or even multiple events can really represent how capable we are or how valuable we are. And we want to keep in mind the bigger picture. So if you notice yourself making meaning in this way, so saying, well, this means that I can't do it, or this means that I'm bad at this, or this means that I don't deserve to work here, remember that no event can define you. Whatever has happened doesn't mean anything about you. It's just an event. And then you might invite yourself to think about what you've learned from the event. This can help you to shift into a learning mindset where instead of taking it personally, you're looking at, well, how can I amend my strategy? How can I adapt next time so that I can grow and learn and change? Our second thinking trap that we might fall into if we're feeling stressed or anxious is generalization. And this is when we expand the situation to reflect all similar situations at work. So thinking in extremes, right? So you might hear people saying things like this, and you certainly might hear it in your own mind, where we tend to say things like, I'm always being told I'm doing it wrong. I can't do anything right. Or no one in my team values the work I do. This thinking trap is irrational because we're really sitting on one end of the spectrum. Most things in life just aren't that clear-cut. They're not always, or everybody, or no one. They're not on one end of the spectrum. They're usually just a bit more balanced than that. Most things happen some of the time, or often, or most of the time, but very rarely do they happen always. And very rarely is it everyone that does something. So when you notice yourself using these extreme words, that is a pointer to you, an identifier to notice that you're falling into generalization, and this is an anxious thinking trap that is only going to make you feel worse. And we really want to then invite ourselves to look for evidence to counter the thought, because what we've done is we've come up with a very extreme assessment of the situation. Everyone does something, or this always happens, or we can never get something right. And we want to invite ourselves to find exceptions to that, just to prove that thought wrong, and that can go a long way to reduce our anxiety. So again, with these thinking traps, these can happen at home too, right? They're not just in work situations. We can bring them into every aspect of our life. So you might find yourself thinking about your partner she always does this, or he never does that. And this is also a prime opportunity to remind yourself to look for evidence that counteracts that. The third really common thinking trap when it comes to anxiety is mind reading. And that's when we worry about what colleagues think of us, or perhaps what our manager thinks of us, and it's particularly feeling as if we're being judged negatively. And what we really do, why it's called mind reading, is we imagine that we know people's intentions and we know what they're thinking. So we might think things like, she wishes I wasn't on her team, or they're not interested in what I have to say. And we just want to realize that we actually can't know what people are thinking. So grounding ourselves and recognizing that often these anxious thoughts are not necessarily accurate. Has there ever been a time that you thought someone was upset with you and you found out that actually they were just busy or had something going on? I like to remind myself of those times in order to keep myself grounded. Remember, we can't know what people are thinking. And again, this is one that can definitely be applied at home, and we might think these sorts of things about our family members or about our friends or other loved ones, guessing at what their intentions are, or how much they respect us, or how they feel about us. And we want to remember that we can't read anybody's mind. So keep an eye out for these different thinking traps. Know that they will only increase your stress and anxiety, and often it's enough just to identify them. By being aware of them, we're able to realize that that's something that you're telling yourself as a result of stress or anxiety. And in many cases, it's enough to just make us able to step back from the thought and recognize that it's not an accurate reflection of reality. And that can do wonders for reducing our stress and anxiety. So when we feel stressed or anxious, one common response might be that we start to avoid whatever is causing our stress or our anxiety. So maybe there are specific things in your home life or in your work life that reliably cause you stress or make you feel anxious, and as a result you avoid doing them. However, this has an unfortunate consequence. What we see is that when we avoid doing things that make us stressed or anxious, it appears to reinforce the anxiety. And this is because while in the short term we get this sense of relief of, oh, I didn't have to do the thing that made me stressed or anxious, over the long run, that anxiety increases because our brain never gets the chance to realize that actually it would have turned out okay. We would have been fine. So in the long term, this can really cause the anxiety to increase, and it can cause mild anxiety to really become paralyzing if we repeatedly avoid doing something. It can also really interfere with our progress at work. Maybe there are aspects of your work that make you anxious, but that you also know if you were able to engage more fully with them, it would really benefit your career. And so we want to be able to manage stress and anxiety better so that we can get to where we want to go. So some common examples of avoidance at work include maybe avoiding taking on new tasks or responsibilities. This can be uncomfortable, and there's a risk of making a mistake if something is unfamiliar. So perhaps it makes you anxious and you feel that it's easier to stick to what you know. Maybe agreeing to deadlines that you likely can't meet. This is a form of avoidance because we might avoid saying no, or avoid saying, well, these are all the responsibilities that I have on my plate and I can't manage that one too. And this might cause a lot of stress and anxiety over the long run because, of course, we may be taking on more than we can handle. And then not raising concerns with our manager, right? Rather just having to deal with them rather than speaking about them because that might make us feel anxious. And then not defining boundaries or expectations with colleagues. And you may have different ways that you notice that you avoid doing things that make you feel stressed or anxious at work or at home. So some examples of how avoidance might play in at home is we might avoid having a difficult conversation with a partner, for example. because that might make us anxious. We might feel that then it's easier to avoid it. But what we'll see over time is in all of these areas, unfortunately, our stress and anxiety around these things is only going to increase. However, there are things that we can do to reduce them. So we can challenge avoidance, and in doing so, we can reduce our anxiety over time. So if there's a particular area of your work that causes you to feel anxious, I encourage you to break it down into smaller goals that feel more manageable. Remember that anxiety increases slightly every time that we avoid doing the thing that we were anxious about. In the same way, we can reduce anxiety by slowly taking action to challenge that avoidance. So if we find manageable ways to challenge that anxiety and to manage it better, to sit in that anxious space or that stressed space, over time we learn, I actually can handle this. Remember that we've learned some different tools to help you to deal with that anxiety. So we've already learned breathing, we've learned to accept the feelings of anxiety, and we've learned to watch out for different negative thinking traps. And this can help us when we are trying to challenge avoidance. But then it's also important that we break the goal down so that it feels small enough that we feel we can do it. It's not overwhelming. So we don't need to cause ourselves an immense amount of stress or anxiety by just going and doing whatever makes us feel anxious. That can certainly cause us a lot more unnecessary stress and anxiety. And rather, the best way to do this is to break this down into manageable actions that you can take. So as an example, if we have Colleen, and Colleen doesn't feel confident, or perhaps she feels very anxious about sharing her ideas in meetings, and maybe going into a meeting where there is a whole boardroom of people feels too anxiety provoking for her to start there. So instead she decides, well, I can start trying to share my ideas in groups of 2 or 3 colleagues and see how that goes. That could be her first step. And what you could really do is you could create almost a ladder of 10 or even more different steps, and you slowly try each one until you're ready to move on to the next step. And this is how we challenge our avoidance, one step at a time. We're slowly building up our confidence, and we'll see that our anxiety reduces over time with each step that we take. Another thing that can be very helpful for managing our stress and anxiety is time management. So not managing our time or our workload effectively can cause us a lot of stress and anxiety. So we also want to be very careful about what we agree to take on. So carefully considering our workload and being realistic when agreeing to deadlines. Remember that it's absolutely okay to share with your manager that you also have these other tasks that you're working on, and ask them what they would like to be prioritized. You can say that it doesn't, if you take on this new task, something else might need to shift. So discuss that. Be willing to be upfront about what you can and can't manage. And remember that it's always better to be upfront so everyone knows where they stand. You're going to save yourself a lot of stress and anxiety rather than taking on more than you can handle and ending up very stressed when it comes to a deadline. So do this as much as you possibly can. Of course, it's going to depend on your specific job role, and it's going to depend on the specific task. Sometimes we might have to take on a bigger workload, and there, of course, we have the breathing and we have other techniques to manage our stress and relieve our stress there. But check in with, do you have some room where you're able to speak up about how much you can take on, and try that out as a way to reduce your stress. Remember that it can also be very helpful to leave additional time for any unexpected tasks that may impede on your time. So sometimes we might be in a habit of scheduling everything that we know we have to do. And then it can be very stressful when something unexpectedly ends up getting added to our workload. So trying to intentionally schedule some additional time means that when these unexpected tasks come up, they're going to cause you less anxiety because you've already prepared for them. And if they don't come up, you're going to feel even more relaxed because you're able to get more done than you had expected. And if your workload feels unmanageable, remember that your first port of call should always be to talk to your manager to find out what can be done. Another great technique for being able to manage stress and reduce anxiety is assertive communication. And as people who are assertive at work have been shown to have lower levels of stress and anxiety when we're using assertive communication in the right balance. So we really want to use assertiveness when the issue is important and addressing it is appropriate. Remember that if there are issues that you are experiencing with your colleagues, for example, keeping them in and not dealing with them can be damaging to our mental health and can cause us a lot of anxiety and stress. So it's important that we address issues, but we do it in a way that respects both parties. Now, if you struggle with anxiety and negative thinking, you may find that you have a lot of negative thoughts and worries about addressing something with someone. Let's say, for example, that there is someone in your team that promises to get data over to you by a certain time. And let's say that you have to put a report together using that data, so you're relying on that data for it to come through. But something that consistently happens is that this person delivers that data to you late. And ultimately you end up very stressed because you don't have enough time to work with it and to put this report together. So let's consider how we can address this example. So maybe you have a worry of, well, I know that colleague, that's a team member, I value them, and I recognize that they have a lot on their plate and they're really busy. And I don't want them to feel that I don't appreciate how busy they are, that I don't understand how busy they are. That might be a worry that comes up. And I always feel that anxiety can sometimes be a strength when we're communicating because we can turn that into empathy that we can show, which is very useful when it comes to being assertive. So if we look at this formula that I've given you, it says, I recognize that, and we can show some empathy. However, I'm sure you can appreciate that, and we can share our point of view. And then I need, and we clearly state our need. And so this formula is very effective. So if we apply it to our example, we can take what was our concern of, I want them to know that I actually value the fact that they are really busy and stressed at the moment. And I also want to honor the fact that I need this work when they say they're going to deliver it. So in this formula, we might say something like, I recognize that you have a lot on your plate right now and that you're really busy. However, I'm sure you can appreciate that I can't put the report together until I have the data. I need you to deliver it to me when you promised you would, right? So we can express empathy and then share our perspective and what we need in this way. And this can really help to create a more positive relationship going forward and reduce our stress and anxiety. So understand that any of these techniques that I've taught you can be used outside of work too. This is not just in work. So even that assertive formula, you could use it with your partner, right? To share that you see their point of view and these are your needs. So they're applicable across the board. Another technique that we might use, and this would more be at home or perhaps if we found a commuting meditation, is mindfulness meditation. And we want to do about 10 minutes of mindfulness meditation per day. So benefits of mindfulness meditation include reduced cortisol levels in the brain. So cortisol is the stress hormone, and we see that this is actually going down after consistent meditation. There's a lower likelihood to develop mood disorders such as anxiety or depression. So we can definitely see it's helpful with anxiety here. And we see that there's improved self-worth as well as benefiting all these abilities we need at work, heightened problem-solving abilities and concentration span. And that's largely because when our stress and anxiety goes down, we can think more clearly, we can concentrate better. So mindfulness meditation can be incredibly beneficial for reducing your stress and reducing your anxiety. And you need to do just 10 minutes a day. And there are many wonderful free meditations and apps out there. Finally, I'm going to share with you a 4-step process that you can use to easily remember many of the points that we have covered today. This process is called RAIN, and it will help you to bring everything together so that you can manage your stress and anxiety effectively. The first step of our RAIN process is the R, and it stands for recognize. And it's a reminder that when we notice that we're feeling stressed or anxious, we want to simply recognize how we're feeling and acknowledge that feeling to ourselves. So we might simply say, I'm feeling anxious because, or I'm worried that, or I'm feeling stressed and overwhelmed about, simply acknowledging this as we learned previously. The A is then an invitation to practice psychological acceptance. Remember that when we resist stress or anxiety, what we find is that these emotions only intensify. Instead, when we accept them and we allow them to be there, this can allow them to soften. In this step, it's also important that we breathe. This can help us to accept it. It can also help us to calm the stressed and anxious feelings. Next is the I, and that's an invitation to investigate how we might be thinking about the situation. So we're looking for any of those common negative thinking traps that I taught you, and we're also looking at how might this stress and anxiety be affecting my behavior. From this, we can then make a choice about our next steps, setting actionable steps that we can take to relieve stress and manage our anxiety. Maybe it's going to be that we recognize we need to be assertive with someone. Perhaps we need to talk to our manager about our workload as it feels unmanageable. Perhaps we need to seek additional support. Or maybe we want to do a relaxation technique, such as meditation. This is really going to depend on the specific stress and the anxiety, but the RAIN process will help guide you to that point where you're able to take some positive proactive action to manage that stress and anxiety. So when we experience stress and anxiety for a short-term period, it's not a problem. As long as we have time to rest and recover, it is not a problem for our well-being to feel stressed or anxious in the short term. But you should seek additional help if you feel that your stress is becoming unmanageable or it persists for a long time. If you notice that your stress and your anxiety are getting in the way of how you'd like to live, either in your personal life or at work, and if your mental health is suffering, these are all instances where we want to seek additional support. Remember not to leave your stress and anxiety unchecked. Chronic stress can ultimately lead to burnout or to the development of mental health issues such as depression or anxiety, so it's important that we take prompt action to deal with these in a healthy way. One way that you can do this is when you notice, or if you notice, that your stress or your anxiety are persisting for a long time or are unmanageable, be sure to speak to your manager. You may want to find out whether your employer offers an employee assistance program or if there's any other mental health support available. So maybe there are mental health champions at your workplace that you could speak to. Be sure to speak to your GP to find out if your GP has any advice on how to manage your stress or anxiety, and you could also seek help from external mental health services. So let's take a look at what we covered today. We define stress as the reaction that we experience when demands that are placed upon us exceed the resources with which we need to cope with those demands. So we really have this imbalance where we don't have enough coping resources to deal with the demands that we're facing at work or at home or in whatever area of our lives. We discussed how anxiety is a feeling of unease, worry, or fear, and it can range from mild to severe. We looked at numerous different ways to manage our stress and anxiety. So when feelings of stress or anxiety came up, we spoke about how important it is to label that feeling, to practice psychological acceptance by allowing it to be there, and then to breathe using our belly. So belly breathing really uses the diaphragm. We're breathing deeply in order to calm that emotional system down in the body and in the brain. We want to question any negative thoughts that we notice and find counter evidence. This can help us to really find some distance from our thoughts and help to soften any anxious thinking patterns. One way that anxiety tends to affect us, we said, is through avoidance. We often start to avoid whatever is making us stressed or anxious, and this can actually make us more stressed or more anxious regarding that area or that situation going forward. So challenging avoidance means that we move step by step into the space that makes us feel stressed or anxious, and we do this in a way that feels manageable so that we can slowly build up our confidence and reduce our anxiety one step at a time. Time management, we said, was so important for keeping our stress levels at a manageable level and reducing our anxiety. It's important that we're honest about how much we can take on and we make realistic assessments before agreeing to deadlines. We spoke about how assertive communication can help to reduce stress and anxiety as we're able to get our needs met, and I gave you a formula that you can use to be more assertive. We then brought this all together in the RAIN process. That's a 4-step process that invites you to recognize how you're feeling, accept how you're feeling, allowing it to be there in psychological acceptance, and then investigating what are you thinking and telling yourself about the situation. What are your next steps? What are you going to do to manage the way that stress and anxiety is affecting you, and to really work with it at the source to relieve stress and relieve anxiety so you can have more control over your thoughts and behaviors. And then some of your next steps may indeed involve seeking additional mental health support, which may be necessary for you and may help you to feel more in control and to get your stress levels and anxiety levels to a more manageable level. My name is Kirsty Gwynn. Thank you so much for doing this training on managing stress and anxiety.